The heavy-handed agent. Suddenly, the deafening siren of a police car was behind him. The partner of the police officer whose bones he had crushed came out of the car. He still had plasters on his face, where he had been hit by the explosion of glass when his vehicle had collided with theirs. He was obviously very angry. Quick as a flash, he attacked him and had him immobilized on the ground, then shoved him into the back seat of the new car. Forced so violently into that small space with no air, Chester felt claustrophobic and his heartbeat raced in his chest. He did not want to go back to the police, sure that this time they would have beaten him to a pulp. After all, he had been caught smashing up the electrics of a gate which did not belong to him. Once arrived at the police station, Chester willingly left the car with his head low and made no complaints. The guard, still furiously talking to himself, shoved him up to the entrance as if he had been a delinquent, handing him over to an agent inside. Whilst the guard referred all the details to the officer on duty, Chester was taken to the end of a desolate corridor and thrown onto an old metal bench. As he sat there, the neon lights in the ceiling worked intermittently, feeding his panic attacks. He was left there alone, for about an hour, unable to move, stretch his legs, or use the toilet. He was tired of sitting still, so he stood up slowly, checking carefully whether someone was about, and, within a couple of steps, he was able to look through a glass door into a courtyard, where he saw his car parked in a corner, its front partly destroyed. He suddenly remembered that he kept a spare amount of cash inside the upholstery of the back seat. He had to get it at any cost. He needed the money and he was hungry. Unfortunately, the door handle was secured by a thick chain and break-proof padlock. He had to find a solution, but at that moment 2 thick, heavy hands landed on his shoulders, squeezing them like a clamp. He turned his head, trying to free himself, but that was a huge mistake. "Think you can get away, do you?" The enormous police officer shouted in his ears, grabbing his hair and dragging him for quite a distance and into a large room, where he was kindly shoved into a sitting position on the ground. Another officer, in plain clothes, sat comfortably at a desk and had no time to ask before Chester burst into tears and recounted his recent adventure, without stopping for breath, telling all of his wife's anger, of the guard, and most of all that he was starving. The officer ordered that his handcuffs be removed and that some food be brought to him from the dispenser in the corridor. Then he gave Chester an order: "Stop crying." There was a moment of silence. The agent took down some notes, as his colleague returned with a coffee and a couple of snacks, which Chester devoured after religiously unwrapping them like the greatest of treasures. The coffee was good, but piping hot, so he drank it very slowly. The man explained to Chester that the guard had actually saved his life. He had dragged him away from the house like that because he knew that his father-in-law had been waiting behind the garage door fully armed. The only doubt in the guard's mind had been whether the man's intentions were rightfully kill him with the excuse of reacting to a break-in, or to kill him and hide his body, denying all knowledge on the strength that no witnesses had been present. Chester was more confused than ever, not understanding what could have been so deserving of murder. In the worst scenario, he might have cheated on the man's daughter, but what right would that man have had to judge him, when he himself regularly carried out extracurricular activities with young women in his office, girls in short skirts and stiletto heels? With a huff, the agent passed him some papers to sign, upon which Chester put his signals without even checking what they were for. However, it was soon clear, as he stood up to open the door and said, "You are free to go." Out in the courtyard, Chester was surprised to find the guard extending a hand to shake his, as a sign of peace, after which he took an envelope out of his coat pocket and handed it to him. Chester thought it looked familiar, and, in fact, it turned out to be containing the stash of cash he was expecting to find in the back seat of his car. The man explained that the car had routinely been checked for drugs and that he had found that envelope hidden in the upholstery, protected by a see-through bag. The nosy next-door neighbor had typically interfered and told the guard what had happened to Chester, which made him realize that he would have been in need of that cash, so he did not hand it in to the police. Chester was moved by such kindness and regretted having thought less of that good man. He stepped forward to embrace him, to show his appreciation and respect, but the guard stopped him by extending an arm between them, preferring a handshake. Chester was after all looking filthy and stank like a dead dog. He walked back to his new and unpleasant home. He was so confused that it did not even occur to him to take a bus. Instead he walked as if in a bubble, like a madman, ignoring and often walking into passers-by, as if completely disconnected to the world around him even when cars honked their horns repeatedly at him, as he blindly crossed the roads in front of them. He even walked far longer than required, as he took a long way around and arrived utterly exhausted, but somehow more serene. The exhaustion had pushed at least some of his worries out of his mind. Staring at the television screen, still turned off, he put his hand in his pocket, took out the money and counted it. There was not much, but at least for tonight he could have afforded a decent meal. But first, he moved the table closer to the bathroom door and sat on the floor, arming himself of screwdrivers, a hammer and an old rusty pair of pliers, emptied the rucksack of everything he had rummaged from the beans and began to take them apart. He had found a pot that must have been around no less than 30 years and filled it with all the bits and pieces which had gold plating. It was almost night before his stomach told him he had to stop, rumbling and groaning a midnight chime of its own. He had to eat. His hunger was increasing by the minute. He had no food in the flat, other than some cans expired by a few years, so he decided to brave the cold and go out into the rainy night. He reckoned he could also buy the acid he needed to extract the gold from that precious pile of electric goods. But first he had to change. He could not go out like that, so he undressed down to his underpants and looked at himself in the mirror. He laughed. At least I got to keep these. He picked up his good clothes, so much more fashionable and elegant, but there was a problem. They were stained with blood. The patch of red on the shirt would have got him into trouble with the law again, as surely the first person to look at him would have thought him to be a serial killer who had just eaten his victim and would immediately inform the police. He had no idea to run into that heavy-handed giant in uniform again, so he decided to run the clothes under the tap. He entered the tiny bathroom and used the only thing he could find, an old bar of soap, which actually did a pretty good job. The fact that it actually seemed to be perfect for the job made him wonder about the likely activities of its previous owner. It seemed that in that flat time had stopped just after the war. Everything was old and dusty, nothing either modern or clean. Even the kitchen cupboard contained biscuits in silver packaging that looked suspiciously like that of rations given to soldiers on mission. Whilst cleaning his clothes, he opened the hot water tap and the warmth reminded him of his lovely bath spa, one of 8 wonderful bathrooms, 2 for each floor of his beautiful mansion, 1 in the garage and 2 more in the garden flat. But when he turned to look at that bathroom, all he could see was a tight shower, encrusted with lime scales and lacking so much as a shower curtain. He dried off the clothes with a hairdryer he had found perchance in a brown leather suitcase under the bed. It must have belonged to the landlord in his youth, as he had never seen that model before. He was rather concerned that turning it on would result in an electric shock strong enough to kill him at that tender age, but he had no choice. He needed to use it. He was consoled by the warmth of the only thing that really worked, the central heating. He was standing in his underwear, but he wasn't cold at all. He rested one hand on a pleasantly warm radiator, whilst with the other he pulled his trousers on. As soon as he was dressed, he searched the flat for an umbrella, because it was truly pouring outside and he had no intention of making himself ill. Rummaging through the dusty pile of stuff inside the closet, he found one, some old relic and huge. He opened it as soon as he was out of the building and noticed printed on the umbrella the advertising of a soft drink that had been out of production for at least 20 years. It looked ridiculously large and colorful, but it sheltered him perfectly. He walked on, trying to avoid the deep paddles and not to be splashed by passing cars, that great umbrella hitting every lamppost as he walked. Seeing the lights of a 24-hour supermarket in the distance, he headed straight there. Inside the store, he launched himself at the hot food counter and grabbed a roast chicken in a bag and a packet of chips. As he started to step away, he thought for a moment and grabbed an extra couple of portions of chips, glad that everything was still nice and hot. Hugging the bags of food like a baby, He went to get the bottles of acid from the household goods aisle. They were expensive, but necessary. At the till, he also deemed necessary a couple of bars of dark, nutty chocolate, his favorite, with the large hazelnuts inside. As he took his money out to pay, he had the impression that the cashier was annoyed by him, and he wondered what the problem might have been. Looking at the floor, he realized some liquid had been leaking and followed the length of the damage with his eyes up to a man with a bottle of wine in his hands who, feeling watched, turned towards the shelves. Chester assumed that he was the usual hard-working type of guy, who arriving late home from work might drown his troubles into a glass of wine or two. He had done that too in the past, but mainly because his wife had regularly left him at home alone, whilst she painted the town red with her girlfriends. He glanced again at the man in black and noticed that he wore a wedding band. He sighed and returned his glance to the dripping umbrella and grinned a wide smile at the lovely smell of his dinner. He packed it into the bag quickly and left, in a sudden phobia, panicking at the thought that the cashier might report him to the police for making that mess in his shop. He just paused by the doors to pick up a newspaper and stretched his arm to leave the relevant coins on the counter. He headed home in the heavy rain, but caught a shadow behind him with the corner of his eye and laughed nervously as he swung around to face him. It was just the man with the wine, walking the same way. He was suddenly blinded by a bright blue light, unable to cover his eyes with his busy hands. Fortunately, the light soon disappeared, as a police car drove past him slowly. Chester assumed they might be searching the area for a criminal, so he hurried home to avoid getting involved. He looked up and the man was no longer there. Strange. He had been walking towards him and there were no side exits that he could have taken. But perhaps the man had forgotten something and had returned to the shop. He turned around and picked up his pace, holding tightly onto the umbrella, struggling against the sudden strong wind. He searched his pockets for his keys and realized the door was open. A push with the tip of his umbrella was enough to open the door properly and allow him to enter. Perhaps someone had broken in. His first suspect was his father-in-law and imagined a rifle pointing at him, the face of that arrogant old man laughing diabolically as he ended his life. But no, the apartment was empty. There was nobody there. It was so small that all could be seen from the front door, even the bathroom. He must have closed the door badly, his mind distracted in all his distress. He probably had not pulled it hard enough, and the lock had not engaged. He dismissed the incident under the pressure of hunger. He glanced at the table, but then sat on the floor and opened the bags of food, tearing one side to open them up into a makeshift tablecloth, and he launched himself at the chicken, still warm, chewing and swallowing through some of the bones as well as all of the meat, suddenly, with his mouth full, realizing that he had forgotten to buy something to drink, not even a can of soda. He got up to get an old glass and rinsed it in the sink. He knew that drinking that water was a bad idea, as the pipes were old and the water could have been contaminated by the rot, but it was that or dying, choked by the delicious, but dry meat which filled his mouth more and more, as he had difficulty swallowing it, but had no intention to spit his out. He braved the tap water then, which after all did not taste too bad, if a bit irony in flavor, but acceptable. He sat back down by the makeshift tablecloth and enjoyed little mouthfuls of delicious chips, which immediately made him forget the rusty and metallic taste of the water. He concluded the nocturne meal with a loud burp, certain that no one would hear, but the neighbors in the flat above immediately banged something on their floor, probably a broomstick, making it clear that every noise could be heard and that he was being rude. That made him think. In Diana's house, he enjoyed listening out to the echo of his rude sounds, and he then remembered the wonderful meals prepared by the cook with her expert Oriental hands. Restored and with a full belly, he got back to work. He put all the gold-plated bits he had extracted from the electrical goods into a glass bowl, filled it with acid, and sank in the clamps of a car battery, of opposite polarity, inserting the plug into the electric socket in the wall. Soon the layers of gold would have separated from the other materials to gather at the bottom of the bowl, close to the positive pole, as safe sediments. After a simple chemical process and filtering, He would have fused the product with the blowtorch, achieving the result of about a gram of pure gold, which he could have sold easily to specialist buyers. Unfortunately, the almost immediate result was a release of toxic fumes, barely visible, but with a strong, sharp smell, immediately filling Chester's airways, who promptly pushed the container, as it was with the battery charger, out of the door. Although it was raining outside, his experiment was sheltered by the stairs of the floor above. Returning inside, he opened the windows to allow ventilation into the room and hoping to push that horrible smell out. Meanwhile, he thought about clearing that misunderstanding which he was sure had happened with Diana. While he thought by the window, he could see far away in the city his father-in-law's skyscraper. He had always been amused, but its odd shape, it reminded him of a gigantic suppository, but it now reminded him sadly that he no longer had a job. His apartment was on a hill, about a mile from the city, which he could see in all its beauty, with its tallest buildings and lights, thousands of tiny lights that made it look like a great spaceship ready to take off. Absorbed in that suggestive night view, he considered that perhaps his father-in-law would have been a better person to ask, especially why he had been fired, even though, as the guard said, he would have welcomed him with a gun in the face and ready to shoot. As he closed the window, he tried to think of a way to get close to him without risking his life. He shut the window and sat on the sofa. It was old, bits of cloth coming off in many parts, but still very comfortable. He was exhausted, his eyes heavy and closing against his will. He needed to rest. He was falling into a deep sleep all at once, but the loud howl of a dog made him jump up to his feet in great fear. Stunned by sleep, he wondered what that strange sound might have been. It sounded like it had come from behind the front door, so he moved close to it slowly in order to look through the spy-hole, but not a soul was outside, just the rain, which fell incessantly. The wild wind must have carried that painful cry from God knows where, he thought, but just to be safe, he turned the key in the lock a second time and put a chair behind the door. That would have ensured that an intruder would have made enough noise to wake him, at least in principle, as to be honest, he really did not believe anything would wake him again, for he was so very tired and most of all stressed out beyond belief. He slowly dragged himself to bed, barely able to keep his eyes open, swinging from side to side with every step until he collapsed onto the bed. He wanted to take off his wet clothes, but all he managed to find strength for was to pull the quilt over himself, covering him right up to his nose. He adjusted the pillow with his fists, and then he fell submissively into Morpheus' arms. Durr! An acute and annoying sound entered violently into Chester's ears. Someone was ringing the doorbell. But who could it be, he thought, jumping onto his feet in fear. Nobody knew of his new address, but he had been taken by surprise. Not least because he had not realized the door had a buzzer. It might have been the landlord, but what could he possibly have wanted from him at that early hour? They had settled on him paying the rent at the end of the month. With his eyes still half shut and dozy, he went to see who it was, trying not to trip up on the lovely handmade quilt that he had dropped off the bed during a few hours of brief and agitated sleep. He walked supporting himself on anything that came close enough to his hands, the way an old man does when in need of a walking stick, on chairs, on the walls, on the table, and, finally, also on the door as he approached it and tried to focus on handle and lock in order to open it. Bam! Suddenly a fist punched him in the face, and his eyes instantly started to water, as he stumbled backwards stunned. He could just about make out a large figure, which could not belong to his landlord. "My dog ran into your bucket of acid, and I've just spent the night at the bloody vet's. I haven't slept a wink thanks to you. You dare put your shit on the stairs again, and first I'll beat the crap out of you, then I will throw you down those steps." That cleared things up. The man walked away quietly, and Chester closed the door, intent on causing no more trouble. The neighbor's dog, who slept on the landing, had been frightened by the loud thunder and lightning, had run downstairs and, thinking the bucket had contained water, had lapped some of the acid and nearly died. The acid had not even been the main culprit, but the poor dog had been victim of a powerful electric shock. Chester had forgotten to unplug the battery charger, at the expense of that poor animal. Wiping blood off his nose in front of the mirror, He thought that the neighbor had been right to hit him. Leaving such a dangerous thing outside had been very irresponsible of him. Having said that, he could not help laughing at the thought of that poor dog's fur, all stiff and curly. It looked like a perm. Fortunately, he managed to wipe off all the blood, but he still had a purple bruise on his cheekbone. He did not like that bruise, but he reckoned he had been lucky not to have been reported to the police. He could not face the psychological pressure of finding himself face to face with the huge and violent agent of the day before. "You can do it," he kept telling himself out loud in front of the mirror, trying to build himself up to meet his father-in-law. The man had always inspired a certain amount of fear in him. Nobody knew what he did in his spare time. Aside from the young girls, he knew that his office was often visited by dangerous-looking people, politicians, military men, and impresario friends who were always followed by thick groups of armed men. Once he even saw a man who had his face covered by a hat and sunglasses, but he had recognized him from a picture in that morning's newspaper. Wanted for murder, the man had entered that office, but strangely had never come out again. He slapped his cheeks in an attempt to wake up properly, then washed his face with cold water, unpleasant, but it worked perfectly. He went outside and noticed that the bowl had gone, probably removed by the neighbor, but he did not feel like asking him for it. His nose was still very sore. He popped back inside to unplug the battery charger, then went out again, this time locking the door once. He ran down the stairs and found the bus with its doors open at the stop, so he jumped in. This time he was well dressed and people ignored him, although the most suspicious passengers wondered what he might have ran into on seeing that half of his face was purple. Chester felt it watched. His greatest fear was to run into someone he knew, a fear which realized itself as a hand rested on his shoulder. He turned around sharply, hoping not to be faced with another violent confrontation, but to his great surprise, it was Ariel. With a reassuring whisper, she said, "I know what happened. I'm sorry. I should not have accepted your help the other night. It's my fault." Chester's eyes betrayed his utter confusion. He had no idea what she was talking about, but Ariel understood how he had been staggering in the darkness, oblivious to the reasons behind his troubles. She grabbed his hand and sweetly pulled him through the opening doors. Off the bus, they found a bar with tables outside, where she invited him to sit with her. Chester sat, trying to make sense of what she had said on the bus, when suddenly a waiter appeared and almost shouted, "Good morning," ready to order, but was immediately petrified by the sight of that bruised face, almost black under one eye. Ariel ordered for them both, remembering well what the man she wanted to marry had liked. The waiter left them, sniggering under his breath, "Women these days." Chester was still lost amongst his thoughts, perplexed, looking around to make sense of where he was. He had made it into the posh end of town. His next thought was whether he could actually afford breakfast. He would never have allowed her to pay for him, although she had always been an independent girl. As he sat there counting the coins he had in his pockets, Ariel called him. Blanked by him, for he was too deeply concentrated to hear her, she kicked him under the table, which worked perfectly. "Ouch. You're beating me up too," he complained, upset. "No, don't worry. I just wanted to say that it's my treat. I know you are going through a rough patch." Having counted his cash, Chester knew she was right. He did need help, but he had never expected that it would have come from the person he had hurt most in his life. The waiter returned quickly, serving her a hot tea and him with a milky espresso, which he took quickly, adding 2 bags of sugar, which he tore at the same time, then drank whilst Ariel began to speak. The night he had rescued her at the café, a friend of his ex, jealous of their happy marriage, had filmed them with her mobile phone and posted everything on her page of a social network, adding a page of false comments, stating that they were lovers, that they often met there, and using as proof the bunch of roses they had found on the table. She went so far as to storm over to her friend's house and told her what she had seen, that cheating dirtbag of a husband, showing her the recording, emphasizing everything with the statement that she had downed for over a year, since they had fought over a pair of shoes at a designer shop, but she had never plucked up the courage to tell her. Chester raised his eyes. Now I understand where all the flying china came from." He had often thought about that moment at the house, and had not been able to make sense of where and how Diana had been able to get all those plates, glasses, crystal statuettes, including the one she had launched at his forehead. Her friend had been there, helping her get her hands on all the ammunitions. It had all been premeditated. They had prepared all the weapons at the ready for when the unfaithful husband would return home. They had placed weapons on the bed, so they could take him by surprise, a total ambush. Chester also remembered that car by the gate with its door open. The woman had hurried out of the car and rushed into the house, anxious to share her malicious gossip, her tongue burning to tell all. Now that all was clear, he was even more intent on clearing matters with both Diana and her father. He drank his coffee like a shot whilst Ariel slowly sipped her tea, refreshing her mouth after having spoken with no interruptions. She then cleared her throat and told him that his father-in-law was trying to get him into trouble. He had falsified his signature on some documents to blame him for some company tax evasion. These showed him to be president of a ghost company which had invoiced millions, and the next step would have been to supply his new address to the tax office. Ariel was particularly worried about this setup, as proving him innocent would have been very difficult, and the allegations were serious enough to mean years in jail. "Come to mine. You can stay in the guest bedroom and have a hot bath," she said. Chester needed help. He needed a hot bath more than anything, but he could not accept this from her, although he sneaked in a sniff of his pungent armpits and grimaced in disgust. "I am a lawyer now. I work for a prestigious firm, and my bosses have been trying to frame your father-in-law for years. I have enough dirt on him to get you out of trouble." As Ariel spoke, her eyes twinkled with tears, as she worried about the future of the man she had cried over for so many years and whom she had only just recaptured. But he refused her help, and, seeing a bus approaching, he stood up to leave, intent on speaking with his father-in-law. Ariel stood up too, her body reaching out to him as she grabbed his arm in an attempt to make him stay and not leave her again. Her womanly instinct told her that a direct conflict with Diana or her father would have been useless. She took her business card from her bag and handed it to him, begging him to see her that same night. The bus arrived, its doors opened, and Chester got on. He stood before the huge suppository-shaped building. He was going to give his side of the story, clear the misunderstanding and prove his good faith. He stepped towards the huge glass doors, through which he could see the receptionist pick up the phone. Before he could even grasp the chrome handle of the door, someone grabbed his shoulders and threw him onto the ground. He rolled like a ball for a few meters, only stopped by the wheel of a parked car. Raising his eyes, he recognized his beater. It was the security guard, who now walked slowly towards him, in order to drag him out of the property. Confronted by that mountain of muscles, Chester could only run away. He would not have been allowed to talk. He knew from the number of times he had seen the man at work with the president's unwanted guests. 2 months in hospital were the result. Igor, an ex-boxer and special forces man, had always disliked Chester's lack of respect for him, his lack of care in wishing him a Merry Christmas, and especially that he never gave him a present. The man hated stingy and unkind people. By the look on his face, it seemed that he had wanted to beat him up out of revenge much more than just to throw Chester out for violation of private property. That tattooed mass was getting closer and closer, and Chester, still on the ground, held his breath in fear and turned pale in the face, his fear turning into sheer terror when he saw the back of a pretty big gun hanging from the inside pocket of the guard's Italian suit. He stood up and ran out of those walls like a cat chased by a dog, starting to run on hands and feet before he had enough time to stand tall. He ran as fast as lightning then, only stopping when he had run out of breath and his heartbeat had turned into strong and unsustainable palpitations. He slowed down to a halt, leaning onto the back of a car, with his back arched as he tried not to choke on the saliva that had been drooling out of his mouth, caused the extreme effort of the escape. The spittle that landed on the shiny varnish of the boot aggravated the owner of the car, who unfortunately was standing right behind Chester. "Now clean it up, you punk!" yelled the man. Chester turned to face him with his eyes red, stinging from the sweat that had been dripping into them, and seeing the man speak into a phone, he screamed, No, not the police, and with his last bit of strength he hopped away from him. He had twisted an ankle on the overgrown root of a tree, which protruded through the tiles of cement that it had pushed off the ground. His sweat mixed with desperate tears. He no longer knew what he was doing, who he was running from. Just that if he wanted to avoid the police, he had to keep running. The intense effort made his head spin, and in his dizzy state, he fell to the ground. And then? "Did you die?" sniggered Argo. "What daft questions!" "No, or I would not be here," Chester answered, rather annoyed and feeling unduly jested. But he knew that the only way he could get out of hospital was to tell all the truth. But should that strange doctor not believe him, at least he would have assumed him to be nuts, in which case he would not have been jailed for tax evasion, which was good. Chester tried to think of something that could cheer him up, and his thought was Aura, so cute and kind, skinny as a rake, but with a great pair of breasts. He looked out of the window and sighed deeply, as Argo chewed on some bars of chocolate. He had to cut the story short. It was getting late, and he really did not want to have to go through it all again at the next session. He also desperately needed the toilet. His bladder was full, and it tugged at his stitches, causing him a mixture of itching and pain, but he started to speak again. He was up suddenly, someone slapping him hard in the face. He had fainted, and the person slapping him hard seemed to enjoy slapping him and was not going to stop.